Mylonas is chief economist and head of investor relations at the National Bank of Greece. Joins me live now from Athens. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Great to have you on the show. So I'm going to start with a very simple question for you. Does Greece need to restructure?
Right now, I don't think restructuring is on the table. I think the agreement with Europe, the Commission, and the IMF is to get the adjustment going, the fiscal adjustment, reducing the deficit, getting a primary surplus, doing the structural reforms so that we have a strong growth rate. Only when those two sort of prior conditions are met can one even think of the possibility, the extreme possibility of restructuring. No creditor will wish to participate in restructuring, even if that was offered, when there's a primary deficit and they're very poor growth prospects.
Okay, so then
the first thing that has to happen is for the next few years.
Sure. I was just going to ask you, does Greece then need more bailout funds because they need to raise some 27 billion next year from the markets? Doesn't look like that's going to happen very easily given that borrowing costs are so high.
That's correct. It seems that the program has led to weaker growth than expected, weaker revenue, a tougher time meeting the 2011 budget target, a decline from 10.5% of GDP in 2010 to 7.5% program for 11. That seems to be looking tough, and therefore the IMF review, I think, is coming up, and the Troika, as we call them, review is coming up with the view that there will be more time is needed for the adjustment, and that's where the idea of an extension of the program, a new program with clearly more financing is probably the ideal way forward.
How much more financing do you anticipate?
The number that is rumored, and I have there's no official numbers here, is something close to 40 to 50 billion. 50 billion has been dispersed from the original 110 billion. That leaves about 60 billion, and there would be an increase to about 100 or 110. Okay. So another 40 to 50 billion. And the program will be extended for 2 years.
Okay. Okay, great. No, I was just going to say, I know that you said restructuring is not an option, but nevertheless, this is something that we're hearing a lot of talk about over the past few days, over the past week, in fact. And the ECB executive board member Lorenzo Pirismaghi has made a strong argument against the restructuring of Greece's debt. He said that it could bring the banking system to its knees. Do you agree with him?
As I said, there are lots of obstacles to a restructuring. I mentioned the macro for Greece. I mentioned the contagion effects. Clearly, the hit on the banking sector is another consideration, and not just the Greek banking sector. Most of the Greek debt is held abroad. 80% is held abroad, and the question is whether those banks could take a restructuring. And the question is, if it's just Greece, would it then also include Ireland and Portugal, in which then case the number gets much larger. As I said, there are also legal considerations. There's an issue of whether restructuring triggers a default, and when a country is in default, that makes a lot of other things more difficult, access to the ECB, etc. So it is just like the question of will Greece leave the euro. I don't think the rational people, the decision makers, are considering it. I know the markets are.
Yeah.
But I would put it differently. The difference is whether Greece at some point will need a reduction in its debt, and that's not synonymous with a restructuring.
I mean,
there can be a reduction in debt through lower interest rates and other fashions.
I mean, you say that the markets are anticipating it, but part of the reason for that are the sort of mixed messages, the conflicting signals that we've been getting from within the Eurozone, and a lot of this confusion and lack of clarity is coming from within the Eurozone itself. You know, the prospect of Greece going back to the drachma. It sounds to me like you would be very concerned about the losses that Greek banks would incur in the event of a restructuring, and indeed other banks in the Eurozone. Can I ask you about the prospect of a voluntary restructuring involving an extension of securities?
I think that's also been excluded. I think the ECB President Trichet has been quite vocal about it. I think S&P's made a very strong statement the other day that even a voluntary reprofiling would be paramount to default, and default makes things far more difficult in terms of eligibility of Greek government bonds at the ECB and many other things. So we do not want, no one wants that issue. I mean, this is tantamount, CDSs could be triggered as well. So this is an issue that no one wants, and everyone is going to make sure that it doesn't happen. Okay. We've learned the lessons of AIG and the Lehman Brothers. This is not going to be allowed to happen.
Mr. Mylonas, you've spoken about the need for your country, for Greece meeting its budget targets, for fiscal adjustments. How difficult is this going to be? I mean, for example, the 50 billion from asset sales. How difficult is it going to be just to push that through when you are facing? We've got another general strike today amidst rising opposition to these measures in the country.
You are absolutely right. Don't forget that Greece took 7% of GDP worth of fiscal adjustment measures in 2010 and is on track for another 7% of GDP of fiscal measures in 2011. That's 14% of GDP in 2 years. That's an unheard of number. And the fact that the protests are so mild and society is understanding the need for adjustment and willing to take the pain. And don't forget, unemployment in the private sector is, adjusting for the large amount of civil servants, is close to 20%. So despite all that, Greece is pushing along on these tough reforms and will continue to do so.
But it's also taking away from economic growth, isn't it?
Unfortunately, when you have a fiscal deficit of 10% of GDP, the best way to achieve growth is to get that down. You're not going to achieve it by cutting taxes. You need to reduce the fiscal deficit to make investors feel that the fiscal regime is credible, and that way you'll get growth. That's the first thing you have to do. Later on, you can reduce taxes. But right now, you need to reduce the deficit. That's the best way to get growth.
Paul Mylonas, Chief Economist, Officer, National Bank of Greece. Wonderful to get your thoughts. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.